Good afternoon, welcome. I'm Digby Ricci, and this is another lecture in our series of lectures on poetry. We continue our discussion of the great poet Emily Dickinson. In the previous lecture, I examined Emily Dickinson's life and the techniques that are characteristic of her poetry. In this particular lecture, I want to examine The Wind Begun to Rock the Grass, which is a poem prescribed by the Independent Examination Board of South Africa. But before I begin my analysis of this poem, I have to acknowledge a slight slip in the previous lecture, and I will do so immodestly by teaching you an English saying. It goes back to ancient Rome and to the works of Horace, and Horace indicated that even Homer, the great creator of the epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, could nod. And the English saying is, Homer nods, and it means even the finest of us can make an error. I do not wish to be too arrogant and place myself in the same class as Homer, but I do wish to acknowledge a small error that I made in my last lecture on Emily Dickinson. The Reverend Charles Wadsworth visited Emily Dickinson at Amherst 5 years after their meeting, and not 6. Forgive that slip of the tongue. I was reading a passage on Dickinson at the time, but I do want to make you aware that one must be absolutely correct, that even the smallest details must be accurate when one is dealing with great poetry. Let us begin by reading the poem in full. The wind begun to rock the grass, with threatening tunes and low, he flung a menace at the earth, a menace at the sky. The leaves unhooked themselves from trees and started all abroad. The dust did scoop itself like hands and threw away the road. The wagons quickened on the streets. The thunder hurried slow. The lightning showed a yellow beak, and then a livid claw. The birds put up the bars to nests. The cattle fled to barns. There came one drop of giant rain, and then, as if the hands that held the dams had parted hold, the waters wrecked the sky, but overlooked my father's house, just quartering a tree. It is a very strange and complex poem, one of many poems that Emily Dickinson wrote about thunderstorms, and on this particular poem she worked very hard, varying it, altering it over a long period of time. I've said it's a strange poem, and you will see immediately that the strangeness begins with the peculiar use of tense. We expect simple past tense. The wind began to rock the grass. But instead we have the wind begun to rock the grass. What does that suggest? Is there an implied pluperfect here? Is the suggestion had begun? Is the first stanza saying that once the wind had begun to rock the grass, exert its power upon the grass, sway the growth, then this mysterious he is able to fling a menace at both earth and sky? So the tense creates a sense of unease within the reader. We're not altogether sure what it means. Is this threat delivered only once the wind has already done what it should do? It has started to sway the world. And what is the antecedent, the preceding noun of the pronoun he? Does this refer to a god figure, or is it simply the personification of the wind? The he occurs at the beginning of a line, so that could account for the capital H. But as you're all aware, I'm sure, there's a great deal of uncertainty and ambiguity here, which certainly is suited to what the poem is all about. The storm starts, and it appears that a huge threat is flung at both the earth and the sky. Let us continue The leaves unhooked themselves from trees and started all abroad. The dust did scoop itself like hands and threw away the road. A very, very interesting stanza indeed, because there the force of the wind does not appear to be hurling the leaves to the ground, flinging them off the branches. The leaves seem to have chosen to unhook themselves, and unhook is a most unusual verb. It suggests that they are stripping themselves, taking off clothing, and feeling the liberation of nakedness. It's a marvelous piece of subtle personification. They cast off their clothes and embark upon a journey. And even more strange is the fact that the dust appears to be both the scooping hands and the contents of the scooping hands. Look at that line. The dust did scoop itself. It picks up itself as if it is forming hands, and then, a frightening image, threw away the road. So the power of the storm causes this dust road to collapse, to be swept away. Only in the third stanza do we have specific reference to human beings. People are not mentioned directly, but the transport of people certainly is. The wagons quickened on the streets. And we would say the wagons there are speeding up as human beings flee for safety. The thunder hurried slow. And there is a very interesting use of oxymoron there, because how does one hurry slowly? The thunder appears to be a speedy and immense force for destruction, and yet the slow rumbling sound, I think the image is auditory there, is emphasized too. So the slow rumbling sound of the thunder suggests that a great force is actually going to sweep down upon the world, and thus the thunder hurried slow. The lightning showed a yellow beak and then a livid claw. A marvelous implied metaphor there. The lightning is like a raptor, a bird of prey. It shows first the yellow beak and then a livid claw. And the use of livid is actually a pun there, because the adjective can have two distinct meanings. The first is a dark bluish grey colour, like the colour of a bruise, livid. And the other is more figurative, meaning very angry. We still use it. I was livid with my class when they didn't pay attention to the Emily Dickinson lesson, or whatever. So the storm is both dramatic in appearance, that bruise-like colour of the sky, which all of us recognise when a storm is brewing, and it seems to be enraged. And it is like a very threatening bird of prey, with beak and claws poised to destroy. And then the victims of the storm are emphasized in the next stanza. And you will notice how skillfully, how subtly, Dickinson establishes links between the natural world and the human world. We've had the reference to wagons, suggesting, of course, that human beings are certainly caught up in the turbulence of the storm. But now birds are described as protecting themselves in a manner that suggests humanity. Just as we bar our windows against a dramatic storm, so it seems that the birds put up the bars to nests. They take refuge in their nests and protect themselves. And the cattle flee to barns. And then the first drop of rain falls, and it is a giant drop linked to the colossus figure of earlier on, hurling a menace at earth and sky, is this immense drop of rain that falls. And then, as if the hands that held the dams had parted, hold. And there's a very skillful use there of enjambment, of run online, to suggest that the hands that held the dams closed and steady now let go, and the floods are unleashed, and the water wrecks the sky. And that too is very unusual. We expect the water to wreck the earth, almost a Noah-like flood. But there is a union here of destructive power. The water wrecked the sky. But overlooked my father's house, dash, just quartering a tree. A very strange ending, I think you will agree. My father's house, the house of the poet, perhaps, but there is a far more profound allusion here. In the Gospel according to St. John, chapter 14, verse 2, there's a very famous passage, and I quote, of course, from the great King James Version of the Bible, the finest English translation, and all of you should use it when you are reading the Bible in English. In the King James Version, this is the passage, the words of Christ himself. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. Emily Dickinson, so knowledgeable of the scriptures, would certainly use that allusion very consciously. So, what is she suggesting? That the storm spares the church, the local church? That would seem to make sense. That, after all, is God's house. Or spares her house, the poet's house, and the local church. Or spares faith, those who have intense faith, and the security of faith. All these are possibilities in this enigmatic and immensely suggestive little poem. Certainly, a house is spared, and it appears that that house is the church, a centre of faith. But a tree is split into pieces. When you are quartered, you are literally divided into 4 pieces. In the Elizabethan age, for example, those who were guilty of treason were hanged, drawn, and quartered. And quartered meant that their bodies were hacked into pieces. So the tree is completely split, but the house of God is spared. Is the poem then an assertion of the importance of faith? That is certainly a possibility. It is an extraordinarily subtle and in many ways a very difficult poem. It is a description of a storm, and a very, very effective one indeed. And it looks at the way in which there is a unity of power, destructive power. Sky and earth seem united during a mighty storm, unleashing force. The poem also subtly suggests, though, that there's something liberating about this particular power. After all, the leaves unhook themselves and begin a journey. Nature seems to be liberated and also oddly harmonious in a storm, because human beings and the natural world are linked. Human beings flee in their wagons, cattle flee to their barns, birds protect themselves in their nests, in a similar manner to the manner in which we shut our doors and bar our windows to a storm. So Dickinson expresses in this poem both fear and a strange sense of exhilarated celebration of the mighty storm. It unites and frees nature for all that it destroys man-made aspects of our world. We, after all, human beings, have made the road, but the road seems to scoop itself up and fling itself away, as if to say, this is how powerless you are in the face of such a mighty display of whose power exactly? Surely there is the suggestion that it is God's power. I think the he does refer to a deity figure who controls earth and sky and plays with those forces when he wishes to do so. I don't think the he is simply a personification of the wind. But then, at the end of the poem, Dickinson is surely underlining the fact that human beings can stand securely against the most magnificent of threats, provided they have some certainty of belief. I do think the Father's house is a reference to faith, strength of belief, and such strength of belief can protect one against the most destructive forces in nature. And the terrifying power of the storm is certainly emphasized in that final image of the mutilated tree. But look at the ambiguity of those last lines created by the very characteristic use of dashes. But overlooked my father's house, dash, just quartering a tree, dash. Are the dashes there suggesting that the quartering of the tree is parenthetical, in a sense unimportant information, just a side effect of the storm? The key point would seem to be the sparing of my father's house. But nevertheless, there is huge destruction elsewhere. Now, in this discussion, I have examined a number of techniques already. The effect of the enjambment to suggest the mighty onrush of the storm, the use of personification, linking the leaves to human activity as if they are pleased to cast off their links to branches and embark on this wild journey that the storm provides for them. And, of course, the marvellous implied metaphor of the storm as a massive bird of prey swooping upon the earth. However, I've deliberately left until now a device that might be entirely new to you, and this occurs in stanza 1 of the poem. Let's read again. The wind begun to rock the grass with threatening tunes and low. Threatening tunes and low. Tunes is interesting because it suggests what I've already discussed, that there is a strange kind of harmony about the united force, sky and earth both lashed, of the storm. But what I'm more interested in exploring is the use of threatening and low. Some commentators have stated that this is an example of hen diadys, and that is spelled Hendiadys, and it's from the Greek, one idea from two. A single complex idea is expressed in a manner in which one would usually use a noun and an adjective, but two nouns are used to express a single idea, or two adjectives are used to express a single idea. That sounds very complicated, but let me give you an example that will clarify it. And this is taken also from classical literature. If in a description of a banquet, guests were described as drinking from goblets and gold, there two nouns are used, goblets and gold, the metal, to express a single idea that they drank from golden goblets. Shakespeare is a master of hen diadys, especially in the play Hamlet, but the example I'm going to give you from Shakespeare is actually from Macbeth. Live and be the show and gaze of the time. Show and gaze, two words to express one idea that, if captured, Macbeth would be displayed to the mockery of people. In the book of Psalms, in the scriptures, people who are described as living in sin and fear of the shadow of death are said to be in misery and iron. 2 words, but 1 idea. The shackles are the misery. So that's Hendiadys, quite complex, I know. Would you say that threatening tunes and low is an example of Hendiadys? I think it probably is. She is suggesting surely that the deep rumbling, the low sound of the storm is the threat. It creates a sense of menace and the building up of power. Now, this is by no means Emily Dickinson's most complex work, and some of you might find it a little frustrating because you will have been struck by the fact that I've asked a great deal of questions during this particular analysis. But I think that is part of the power, the wonder of the poem. We can debate so much. For what it is worth, my view is that it is a description of a storm, to state the obvious, but Emily Dickinson is also playing with the idea of how we should respond to such manifestations of power, of might in nature. We can be frightened, certainly. We must protect ourselves, certainly. But we must see a kind of unified magnificence about such an event and recognize in it the extraordinary power of a deity. At the same time, she is suggesting that we are perhaps best protected by our response to the storm. If we have some kind of certainty, some belief in ourselves and about our Creator, she does seem subtly to be suggesting we are protected, the sparing of my Father's house, despite the quartering of other aspects of the world. You will notice the poem is expressed in 4-line stanzas, quatrains, and the rhythm of the poem is iambic tetrameter, unstressed, stressed, 4 feet to a line, followed by iambic trimeter, unstressed, stressed, 3 feet to a line. And the shorter lines tend to have the effect of rounding off a point that has already been made. Such details are by no means merely interesting and certainly are not trivial. Everything in an Emily Dickinson poem, as in any great poem, contributes to the meaning. And I think this is an appropriate point at which we can end our discussion of this extraordinary poet, the lady who was nicknamed by many the Moth of Amherst because of her perpetual use of white clothing and her retreat into darkness and interiors. Despite her reclusiveness, however, she was able to probe, as few literary geniuses have been able to probe, the most profound issues about humanity. As Ted Hughes has put it very memorably, Emily Dickinson grasped the center and the circumference of things, the core of existence and all that surrounds us. And this she achieved in an extraordinary series of usually very short but devastating poems. Thank you very much.